I'm going to ask Mark Webber from the Computer History Museum. He's got a quick announcement to make about donations and some transcripts that are available for the press of conversations that took place quite a while ago. And then I'll call upon Steve to come up and join us. So sorry, Steve, just a second. Mark, if you're here to... He ain't here. Okay, let's put this whole thing on hold for 30 seconds and I'll go find him. Sorry, guys. Is Mark Webber here? I think not too. Okay, Steve, do you want to carry on, and we'll have Mark come up at the end of the session. Okay.
Very good. Okay. Thank you. Maybe we could have somebody start to shut the doors so we could, we're not disturbed by the noise. But what we wanted to do in this next section is to really focus on, are there lessons that we can learn from the process that conceived the internet? And so we want to take a look at what we think are a couple of areas that you've heard about this morning. The first panel, we want to think about the interplay between government, academia, and industry that we heard about this morning, how important that was to the creation of the Ethernet, and really take a view of how did that work back then, and then what are the lessons we could learn, and what are the lessons that apply to today, because it's a different world. And the other two panels, we will focus on architecture and standards, which again, we've heard a lot of discussion about this morning. So with that, I'm really pleased to welcome this august panel. I'm going to steal from Paul and do the haiku introductions. We have Judy Estrin, and Bridge is really a great overview of Judy. And in addition, Closing the Innovation Gap, which is a book she's written that directly addresses this topic we're going to discuss about today. Bill English and the mouse are really almost synonymous, or should be if they're not to you. Paul Graham's NASA. Bill Spencer and PARC, one of my predecessors at PARC. And I think I've captured everybody. So maybe Yogan, I'm sorry, geez, thank you. Yogan, Claris and Metaphor. I think represent some of Yogan's significant contributions. So to begin, I thought it might be useful to have the two Bills really start with Bill Spencer. Tell us a little bit about how academic, industry, and government collaboration did work back at PARC around the time of the creation of the Ethernet, and his view of, what worked, what didn't, and what we might learn from that.
Okay, Steve. Is this on? It sounds like maybe it's an echo. Two things you learn when you've been around as long as I have, and those are, don't follow Bob Metcalf and John Schock in talking, because they're both very eloquent. They're both full of stories that trace back to, I think. But I want to go back and talk about PARC just a minute. And let me set the context for it. I came there as a relatively young researcher and manager at a critical time. PARC had been broken into two parts at the end of the 1990s. And anybody who was there can remember the tremendous infighting over everything at that time. Also, if you remember, does anybody here remember the articles that came out in Fortune by Bro Utah about the lab that ran away from Xerox? Anybody here? A few. What about Doug Smith's book about fumbling the future? Those were there when I arrived in a lab that had been split into two parts. However, it was a very innovative and productive place during the 1970s and 1980s. The work that you heard about this morning in Ethernet certainly had an input part partly from federal government, as well as an environment that Xerox had set up that allowed a great deal of freedom in approaching problems. George Pake, when he put this lab together, said that don't ask me for 10 years for any return to Xerox. Well, 10 years were up in the early 80s. And let me describe one other example of a tie between research that was done at PARC with a lot of collaboration with universities, funded partly by the federal government, that resulted in a company that had fairly good returns to both Xerox, the starters of that company, as well as the early investors. I still run into time to time and people in San Francisco who invested in this company. Xerox had an interest in laser printing. As a result of that, there was a major research effort in solid-state lasers with the belief it could be applied to laser printing and improve the quality and reduce the cost with solid-state devices. A lot of that work was funded by DARPA at the time. In the mid-'80s, or a little before that, Spectrophysics approached us about the possibility of forming a company that would be funded by Spectrophysics with technology from Xerox and manufacture laser diodes. The ties to universities were mostly through the students that we hired in those days. Xerox, like Bell Labs, where I was when I came to Xerox, had extensive university ties, a lot of students there, faculty there in the summers for sabbaticals, and a lot of our scientists went back to universities to lecture, sometimes to stay there and teach for a year or so. So strong ties to the universities as a source of good people and some good ideas. The agreement between Spectrophysics and Xerox was we would form a company, Spectrophysics would manage it, would provide the fundings for it, and Xerox would provide the technology and some of the key people. Now you have to remember, this is a time in which Bob had started 3Com, Chuck Geschke and John Warnock had left to do Adobe, Tu Chen left to do Comag, Charles Simoni went to Microsoft, and you can argue over what he took with him to work on Microsoft Word. So the articles and books that were appearing about Xerox being able to generate interesting ideas but not able to commercialize them was a real issue for us. This joint venture, I think, set a trend for research labs that I hadn't seen at Bell Labs or in my ties with IBM or any of the other universities, now perhaps any of the other major industries. Now, maybe they were, and I just didn't know about them. But anyway, this was set up, and this new company started. The advantage was they had higher power laser diodes, more efficient than anybody else had been able to make up at that point. Company was highly successful. There's a lot of humorous stories about it. I'll save those for questions if you want to ask. At the top of the dot-com bubble in 1999, that company was sold for $41 billion. That's with a B, almost up to today's standards of companies that went out. Xerox ownership in that company was 40%. The other companies that we started out, we spun out in the mid-'80s, we owned smaller amounts, but the total amount that Xerox could have returned from those investments, had they kept their ownership until the late 90s, would have endowed the entire research program, not just PARC, at Xerox. But for reasons that I didn't understand then, I don't understand now. We sold our equity much sooner.
So that's an example of a successful collaboration.
Could a couple of questions, a couple of things from that I want to make a point. One is, I think those research labs like Xerox PARC, IBM, Bell Labs, others are no longer in existence today. That source of new ideas and ways to make new companies does not exist today. Secondly, I think the funding as a result of this, the funding of new ideas is hurting. But I think those companies that were able to start in the mid-'80s, and there were 4 of them, 3 of which were successful, were an example of how government funding at a research lab like PARC was, with close ties to universities, was a way to generate new ideas and to take those ideas to the market successfully.
Thank you. So I think I'd like to spend a little time now thinking about how those apply to today. So, Judy, I know you've got some opinions on whether we're approaching this in the right way today or not. So maybe you could share those.
So, we all talk a lot about innovation, and there's clearly lots of innovation going on, but if we were in today's environment back when Bob and everybody else here were working on many of the inventions you saw, it wouldn't get funded and it wouldn't have gotten done. And there are really 2 fundamental changes today, I think, in what I call the innovation ecosystem. And the first is that the funding is very different. So government funding for basic science is not only down, but it is allocated in a different way. The way the DoD used to fund basic research is very different than what we have today. And NSF is great, but it can't address all of the problems that we have. So we have not enough funding going into the really early, crazy discovery capital that are really the seed corn that leads to this. But more apropos to what we're hearing about today and what was just talked about is we're missing the role that the labs played was less the basic research than the translational applied research. Taking some of those basic concepts and being able to invent and then try at scale. What was so phenomenal about Xerox PARC is it wasn't just an idea, but it was the proof of the concept and being able to iterate on those ideas until they worked well enough that a little startup called Bridge or 3Com or someone else could actually take those ideas and make them work with a small amount of funding. So we're missing this translational piece, and it is falling on either the universities to try to come up with novel ways to do it and not always successful, or large corporations who tend to only focus on areas that are helping their short-term bottom line. So we're missing a piece today in that innovation system that venture capitalists can't fund and large corporations can't because of their focus on short-term profits. So we do have a problem. I think there are a number of ways of addressing those. Nonprofits are coming in, the Gates Foundation, other ways of funding, but we need to be looking at that whole cycle, or 20 years from now, we're not going to have the type of innovation that we have today that is being built on all of the things that were done 40 years. I keep saying 20 years ago, but I'm getting older and older, so I should start saying 40 and 50 years ago. So.
Well, I think there's maybe two follow-ons for that. Maybe I'd like to hear maybe from Paul on NASA's view of that, how basic and applied, and then Yogan, you spent a career as a venture fund investor, and is this really a problem, or do we have a more efficient way to do it? So,
federal government funding has diminished, unfortunately. But it's still quite prevalent. Before I came today, I just went to the National Science Foundation website, and they have 23 pages of solicitations for new funding opportunities. Unfortunately, most of these funding opportunities are less than $500,000. Most are actually far less than that. And also the emphasis is more on quick rate of return. I know that I sit on a number of, I have sat on a number of boards where we do their evaluations, and usually we look at like a 5-year return on investment, something that can help us now. Basic research seems to be, emphasis seems to be diminishing, and we need the basic research to build a foundation for the great scientific breakthroughs that require this. Also, funding for education, encouraging majors in engineering, science has to continue.
Well, from my perspective, when you think about what government, academia, and industry have done, it's really doing discovery or enabling innovation, and industry enables entrepreneurship that is actually bringing that innovation to the marketplace. And I think in the past we had academia represented by universities as well as these specialty research labs like PARC, BBN, SRI, and other places that Judy alluded to, and those are no longer players. So you're really left with government, academia, universities, and industry, that is the entrepreneurs. Unfortunately, today you're seeing all the, quote, innovation being redefined as really talking about entrepreneurship. Venture capitalists and entrepreneurs are really taking innovation out of academic environments and commercializing it. And I think we all feel that the well's running dry in terms of where is the new discovery coming from. It isn't going to be in the markets that we understand today, but it's going to be in the markets of tomorrow, or the businesses that will be important tomorrow. Bob, alluded in his presentation about new markets, whether they be energy, medicine, or healthcare, or education. You've got to have breakthroughs. So who's going to fund this breakthrough? When I was at Xerox, people weren't preoccupied with creating an idea and then going out and raising venture capital and making millions and millions of dollars. That came after the innovation had been created. They had free reign of doing what they wanted to do and make real breakthroughs occur. And I think we've got to create an environment. Is it the Genius Awards that many of the successful entrepreneurs are creating or not? But we really have to go back to the discovery phase and have discovery convert itself into innovation before entrepreneurs can take that innovation and bring it to the mass market.
I think the other thing that has fundamentally shifted from, again, when a lot of us started our careers, is that the breakthroughs that are, and nobody should think for a minute that there aren't scientists out there starving for that funding, because the amount of activity, I sit on the advisory board of the BioX Institute at Stanford, and the level of creativity and new ideas and problems that really need to be solved in the intersection of biology and engineering and chemistry, that's what the X stands for with biology, is phenomenal. But for every one of those researchers, every one of those scientists are just starving for money. But the main thing I want to say is what's very different today is that everything has become much more interdisciplinary. And so it doesn't fit, at least on the research side, it doesn't fit into the clean boxes that it did at the beginning of the computer industry, because we were building a new era in the technology segment. Now it is about applying technology to brain research, or applying technology to diseases, or applying technology not just to illnesses, but to wellness and managing wellness. So I think that, or education, as Bob said in his presentation. So I think the funding issues have actually become more complex, because you no longer can go to a single, the funders can no longer fund in boxes. You can't have someone who's an expert in technology, or an expert in healthcare, or an expert in energy, or think about the NIH separate from NSF or DARPA, because everything crosses over. And so I think the way you fund and the way you make decisions to fund has become more complex, because the problems we have to solve require interdisciplinary solutions.
So, Bill English, you spent some time at a, SRI, significant government funding, PARC, a corporate research lab. Any observations, from your experiences?
Well, an observation relative to government funding, I think that depends largely on individuals in the government. Bob Taylor is an outstanding example. He did more than anyone I know in terms of funding all levels of research. And I don't see that happening today. I think today our government has devolved to the point where the question asked in any case of funding is how it plays politically, and that's unfortunate. I don't know how we'll get past that.
So we're too afraid of the Golden Fleece Award to fund the right things?
I'm sorry, I have trouble hearing you, but...
I'm sorry, I was saying that, so we're afraid of there was the famous senator who awarded the Golden Fleece Award for kind of the stupidest research, and so we become afraid of funding the outlandish. At NASA, are there any outlandish things?
We have we used to have the SETI Institute at NASA at one time, but that became sort of unpopular, so it was moved out, so now it's an independent organization. But that's an example of like the Golden Fleece Award. No one was interested in little green people, so that project got outsourced.
And privatized.
Yes, it did, yes.
So is there, so a couple questions that brings to my mind is, one is we're talking about the U.S. Is there anything that we can learn from other countries and adopt? And, privatization maybe has a role here. And so what do people think about that? The Gates Foundation, Genius Awards, how would we, how would we leverage those, or are those a bad idea?
I don't want to monopolize it, but I guess you asked two questions. One is privatization is not a bad idea, and no, it's not, just as long as it is in balance with other forms of funding. The one issue with privatization, if you look at industry is driven by short-term returns right now, and so it's very hard for industry to fund the type of work we need. If you look at privatization in terms of the ultra-wealthy and foundations, actually there's a lot of great work going on there, whether it's the MacArthur Foundation or the Coulter Foundation or the Gates Foundation. And I think there it's individuals. If you have the right individuals making the decisions, because it's not just about how much money, it's about how the decisions are made, what to fund, and whether or not you're willing to take risks, and whether or not you're willing to fund something that people think is crazy, because if you're not funding some of those crazy ideas, you're not going to end up with the right portfolio. So I think that solves part of the problem, but we can't look to that as solving all the problem. We need the right balance. And when you talk about other countries, I think there are other countries that do good jobs at part of this. In China, they do a better job investing in science and research, but not the whole cycle. I still think that we have an edge when you look at the areas that Yogan was talking about in terms of the whole ecosystem of going from scientific discovery through to actual innovations that can help people solve problems. And the one country that comes close, not so much in basic research, but in the rest of the cycle, is Israel. And they do have the funding, the government involvement, and probably because of the strong investment that the military there needs to make in the training of people, I would say comes the closest to what we have here. But I haven't seen any other. I've seen other countries that do a better job in policy or a better job in research, but certainly not in the whole ecosystem.
I don't think there's any place in the world that is a better place to take an idea to the market than the United States is. We've got an active venture world, the ability to try and succeed or fail is unparalleled anywhere in the world. I believe the university system we have is the best in the world. There's no question that we attract the very best people from all over the world. Our education system provides something that no other nation has. If you look at the top universities worldwide, 18 out of 20 are in the United States, and the 2 that aren't, I'm not sure how they got there in England. But I think we're unparalleled in those areas. The thing that's happened that I think is unfortunate is that the major industrial research labs where a lot of these ideas were baked into product have disappeared. If you look back at the history of Xerox and the Bell system where I was familiar, 1975, the government forced Xerox to give up all of its patents, which resulted in our cost to copy today being a lot less than it would have been had that stayed a monopoly. In 1984, the Bell system was broken up. That may have been a good idea, but in my view, it ruined the world's best research laboratory. I don't think the transistor, although there was a big effort at Purdue at the time, I think the transistor would have been invented had it not been, at that time, had it not been for Bell Labs. Not the 3 scientists who won the Nobel Prize for it, but the support activity they had from other people who were eminent scientists, and were not recognized the way those 3 were. So we're ahead in those areas. Are we going to be able to stay? I'm not sure. The thing that concerns me the most is that we have lost the lead in our industrial laboratories.
It seems to me, just a comment on that Google is one of those companies that is really pushing the envelope on just about anything in terms of being bold, you know. I mean, you wouldn't think a search company wanted to create driverless cars, but they are. And so it's these kinds of initiatives that you're never quite sure of where they'll land up, is what Xerox PARC and SRI and all these places did. They devoted corporate R&D dollars not just for the next obvious product, but for something that was possibly going to be a couple of generations away. And you might think, well, if Google Maps is an important part of their core technology, then driverless cars maybe fits that particular innovation thread or timeline.
I think in those areas where you look at Facebook and Google and the companies who started on building on ideas that were taken from a number of places and using technology that's there is just outstanding. And those are examples of universities contributing to this. I think that's important. We need to keep that. I think we're missing it in a number of other places other than that area.
Well, but just to, I would differentiate between Facebook and Google in this area, and I think what Yogan was referring to was not Google proper, but the research
Google X.
Part of Google, and there's various places where that's done. And if you look in the technology industry today, it's really Google and Microsoft are the 2 companies that can afford to actually have a research arm. And the same thing happens in the pharmaceutical sector. One of the problems is, again, when you go back to the interdisciplinary nature of the problems, is that Google crosses over a little bit, but it's hard to get the crossover. The beauty of Bell Labs was the interdisciplinary nature of the people that it attracted, allowed us to, and allowed them, not us, but them to come up with a different type of invention. So there still is a big gap that we have today.
The commercial firms in the U.S., and I agree with Bill on this, are extremely effective. I know that NASA has more or less begun to encourage private firms like SpaceX and others to build space vehicles to handle the, for lack of a better word, commercialization of the near space area. One thing, however, is that commercial firms tend to be short-sighted. Most of them don't appear to be too inclined to investigate basic research for the future that builds a foundation. And that's one thing that really needs to be improved. But I think that the industry in the U.S. is vastly surpassed in an area of innovation, just unsurpassed. And that's why the government like NASA is trying to commercialization as much as possible and encourage private industry to build spacecraft and the like.
So let me, we have a few minutes left. Let's take some questions from the audience. I see I've got a hand up.
I am, sorry, Bob Emerson, freelance writer. Are Apple doing basic research? I mean, they've certainly got enough money in the bank to fund it, haven't they?
I don't think Apple has. Apple is an unbelievably innovative company and has at times done applied research and comes up with wonderful new devices that we all like that are very advanced. But I don't think they've ever believed in investing in basic research. And you know, everybody that's not judgmental. It's just saying they don't play that role in the ecosystem. And there are some corporations that feel that they have a responsibility to contribute to academic research more than others. Some do it because they feel a responsibility, some do it because they want to hire talent. And one of the things that we ought to point out, and someone was talking about the flow of people to PARC, one of the really important aspects of investing in basic research is not just the discoveries that come out of it, but it's actually the people you're training. It's those graduate students and postgrad, it's that working and learning the way of scientific thinking, and those people then go out into the world and make better innovators, better leaders, better problem solvers because they have gone through that process and spent time in a research arena. So it's not just about the ideas, it's also about the people that carry those ideas out into the world.
And you might
argue
argue that, as Bob, that universities are such a great place because every 4 years you get a new bunch of extremely talented people.
Sometimes longer. They're longer.
So in the case of Ethernet, we had ARPA sponsoring research at Harvard and MIT. Then we had Xerox sponsoring research in its corporate research lab. And then we had the venture capital community sponsoring a bunch of companies, including 3Com, to commercialize it. So all the modes that you've been talking about played a role in that, successful. So what did we learn? That should we have done one of them more, or one of them less, or was the balance right? I guess we're worried.
I think we learned how important all of those aspects are to the cycle, because if you had taken any of it out, I don't think we'd be where we are today in terms of where the market and the role that networking plays in everything we do. So my point is that the players in that cycle that you named all played a really important role in taking what was a phenomenal idea and getting it to a place where it is, we can't live without it.
I think we've got time for one last question.
Yeah.
But just before, let me add to Bob. Bob, I think you picked an important area, but there's a couple of real weak links in that now. The Xerox PARC has changed. Bell Labs has changed. Those areas where a lot of these things came from have changed, and we've got to find a way to bring that back in some way. Can we do it in universities, in government labs? Don't know. But I think that's changed. Secondly, I think the research that you had on Ethernet and Don Cyphers had on laser diodes isn't possible today. I just don't believe that would be done today. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I've been away from that for a while, but I think those are two things that have changed dramatically in the last 20 years.
The one last question.
My name is Harsh Kumar from Intel Corporation, and what I see is that right now we have a big challenge of manufacturing, and most of the manufacturing is done offshore. It's a big research area and development cooperation among industry and the academia and the government. What do you guys think about that, and what's happening in our country on this one?
Well, I think it says there's lots of talent in other places from a research standpoint. I think the idea of globalizing research is a good idea. Those results, if they're available then to anyone, I think the environment in the United States will lead to our being able to capitalize on those better than anywhere else, no matter where the research is done.
I think globalizing research is a very important idea, but giving up research is a terrible idea. So anybody who thinks that we as a country can just innovate on other countries' investment in research is making a huge mistake. You partner well and collaborate well when you partner from a position of strength. And we need to, as we collaborate and with the whole world, we need to make sure that we still have our roots healthy, because it is not true. I don't believe it's true that we as an economy or as an innovation system and as a society can continue to thrive if we just decide to let someone else invest in the research part, and then we'll just take those ideas and do a good job bringing it to market. You can't separate it out that way.
I think we need to end here, and I'd like to thank the panel